Welcome back to Punk Rock Theologian. Today, I want to give you what may be the most important piece of advice when it comes to studying the Bible on your own, and that is simply that context matters. The most common issue is so many verses are taken completely out of context, and they sound like they mean something totally different than they really mean. But plucking verses out of context is not actually the thing that I really want to talk about today. It's cultural context. When we come across stuff that you read it and it's like, ooh, that doesn't sound very good. A lot of the time, it's because we're reading it from the 21st century, and that is a whole lot different from the world where this was written and given. For example, let me read to you Deuteronomy 22, starting at verse 28. It says, suppose a man has intercourse with a young woman who is a virgin but is not engaged to be married. If they are discovered, he must pay her father 50 pieces of silver. Then he must marry the young woman because he violated her, and he may never divorce her as long as he lives. Now, from our culture looking backward, this sounds a lot like the guy can just grab any girl he wants, and if he happens to get caught, then he bribes her dad 50 bucks and she's forced to marry her rapist. That sounds pretty stinking gross. That's why we need to look a bit deeper. Because this law, this was given when the Israelites were fresh out of Egypt. The general culture of the time was that any woman, which is defined as just a female who has experienced her first menstrual cycle, so if she's old enough to reproduce, and she's not married or engaged, but she has sex, she's then deemed unclean and unmarriable for life. It's a life sentence for this poor girl, whether she was complicit or not. And there was absolutely no penalty for the man. We can find examples of this in Scripture. Genesis 20 includes one of the worst stories of good old Father Abraham. Starting in verse 2, it says, Abraham introduced his wife Sarah by saying, she is my sister. So King Abimelech of Gerar sent for Sarah and had her brought to him at his palace. But that night, God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, you're a dead man, for that woman you have taken is already married. Don't miss some of the key details in that. The only big deal in this was that Sarah was married. Notice how there's absolutely nothing of what Sarah thought of this. She doesn't even have a voice in this. But it's only when it came up that it said, no, she's married. And he's like, whoa, hey, I didn't know she was married. I thought she was just his sister. I just took his sister. I didn't know I was taking his wife. And what is mind blowing is the fact that this whole thing happens again later in Genesis 26. Abraham once again passes off Sarah as his sister, but then they get found out. And verse 10 says, how could you do this to us? Abimelech explained. One of my people might easily have taken your wife and slept with her, and you would have made us guilty of great sin. His only concern was that anyone could have decided to sleep with her, regardless of anything she said, and it would have only been a problem since she was actually married. One more example, Genesis chapter 34. A local ruler named Shechem rapes Judah's daughter Dinah, and only her brothers thought that was a big deal. The locals could care less. Even Jacob, who knew full well how culture worked, was afraid to even stick up for her. And so it was in this culture, in this kind of a situation, that God chimed in with this law and said, no, you cannot just violate his daughters. Matter of fact, if you try this nonsense, whether she is compliant with it or not, you, buddy, just made a commitment. For starters, you have to pay her father. And that's not because the woman doesn't matter. Frankly, it's exactly the opposite. Again, we're in a society where women couldn't even legally own property. And so this had to be in her father's name. But what is paid to him, the same thing that was paid as a dowry, this is kind of her nest egg. This is, if anything goes wrong, this is what she has to live on. That money is for her. That's not just paying to purchase her. You're not paying him off, but you're setting her up to become financially independent. And oh, yeah, it's not just a few bucks, it's 50 days' wages. Which, side note, is kind of funny to me that that's just about 2 months, which makes me wonder if this might have something to do with the old tradition that said an engagement ring should cost about 2 months' salary. I've got nothing to prove that one way or the other, but it just kind of caught my attention. But we don't even stop there. Not only do you have to pay, but now you have to marry her and give her your name. Let her be respectable in society. She is not damaged goods, she's your wife. And oh, yeah, you can never back out of this for your entire life. If you do, the entire community is going to stone you to death. This is just one example of something that we look at it and it seems wrong to us. It doesn't sit right with our modern perspective. But if you look into it, it's actually almost exactly the opposite of what it feels like to us on the surface. This felt like it belittled and devalued women, but in fact, it gave them dramatically more value than they had had before, and it held men to a much higher standard than they had ever been held to before. The truth of the matter is that the role of women throughout history and around the world is drastically more elevated in areas where a Judeo Christian worldview has heavily influenced the culture. I'm never going to claim that only Christianity has ever valued women, but you can study the history for yourself. The plain truth is that the very culture we live in now that makes this old law look so bad to us actually resulted from having this law and others like it. This is why context is so important. When you run into things you don't get or that even you don't like, that's not time to throw up your hands and abandon the whole thing. That's time to lean in and find a better understanding. And over all of it, ask God to show you. He loves to explain things to us. Like any good teacher, he's delighted when someone really wants to learn, and he will help you in the process. And if you're honestly seeking the truth, not just trying to form an argument, but you want the truth, he will always meet you there and show you. Not necessarily on the timeline we want, but he will continue to guide us one step at a time to take us exactly where we need to be.